about Arthur Conan Doyle and some of his Gothic and horror stories that he wrote in the time prior to The Hound of the Baskerville. Charles is a master bootmaker of the Bootmakers of Toronto. He's also a member of the BSI and just a generally nice person in all around. So, Charles, I've lost you on my screen, but hopefully you are still there.
Yep, I'm here.
Fantastic. Charles, the floor is yours.
Okie dokie. Let's see if I can make this actually work. Where the hell is it? Uh-oh, hang on. Where'd screen 2 go? There we go. What do you, no, that's not right. Of course, everything worked perfectly when I tried it last time.
Of course, yeah.
All right. Why is it not doing this? This is weird. Screen 2. Nope. Sorry, guys. I don't know what the hell's going on here. Let's try this.
While Charles is going through the technical part, I will say if you have any questions, please in the chat field just type the word question, and when the presentation is over, I will call on you to ask your question, and then you will just unmute and ask your question. Charles is back now.
Hey, have we got a screen up?
We have a screen up. We have.
Excellent, since I can't actually see it. All right, as long as we're up there and we're good to go. Am I able to move between screens? Yes. Okay. All right, we'll just dive right in. For many a Sherlockian and most laymen, it's a given that the Hound of the Baskervilles is the most famous, popular, successful, well-known, and for some, the best tale to feature Sherlock Holmes. No real surprise there, as it is easily Doyle's best-selling novel and certainly the least clunky. It's been adapted for film, television, and radio more often than any other Sherlock Holmes story and has never fallen out of print. Yet, to be fair, it's hardly what anyone would call a model of detective or crime fiction, and is also entirely atypical in comparison to the other 59 stories that comprise the Sherlockian canon. The star hero is off screen for half of it. The setting is as far away from Holmes's typical, highly urban domain as possible. The plot is centered on a rather ludicrous inheritance scheme perpetrated under cover of a supernatural family curse, where the murder weapon turns out to be a dog. But the only targeted victim to die, Selden, being an accident, does so from a weak heart. Yet, all the same, it's an undeniably compelling piece of work. It's loaded with an eerie supernatural atmosphere, with palpable tension and dread. It pits man against nature, the bog, the dog, the rational versus the irrational, the physical versus the metaphysical. And for the first time reader, it successfully maintains, right up until the end, a possibility, an uncertainty that the threat just might be ghostly rather than physical. These are not characteristic elements of detective fiction, nor of Sherlock Holmes stories, but that isn't what Hound was ever meant to be. Hell, it wasn't even originally intended to be a Sherlock Holmes story. Instead, what it is a masterful cornerstone and last hurrah in a genre that dominated the 19th century literary landscape, the Victorian Gothic. It holds its own alongside the likes of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Robert Louis Stevenson's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and Bram Stoker's Dracula. And while Hound may be anything but a typical Sherlock Holmes story, for anyone familiar with ACD's non-Sherlockian writing, its development and existence makes it perhaps the most typical and natural pinnacle of Arthur Conan Doyle's 50-plus years as a published author. The Hound of the Baskervilles was not just a one-off that came out to Doyle out of the ether, but was simply a case of the author carrying on as he started. You see, by the time Hound was published in 1902, Doyle had written and published some 30-plus stories that would fall under the broad umbrella of Gothic, horror, or weird tale, and would write at least another 10 before his death. The Gothic was, a part of Doyle's consciousness, practically part of his DNA. He was born in Edinburgh, an ancient city steeped in Celtic lore, yet also the seat of modern medicine, to a family of Catholic Irish artists. His mother was a genealogy nut, spinning stories of family history, knights and chivalry, inculcating a love of literature in young Arthur. His father was best known for artwork featuring fairies, but suffered from epilepsy and alcoholism, becoming a literal family Gothic secret. Locked away in an upstairs room and eventually dying in an asylum. There was little money as a result, so his mother took in a lodger, Dr. Brian Charles Waller, who would supplant his father's role in the family to the point where in 1882, Mary Doyle would go to live in a cottage on Waller's estate until 1917. Whatever Waller's relationship with Arthur's mother or sister, Doyle avoids the topic in his autobiographical writings, but he certainly casts a shadow in a number of ACD's Gothic stories. And it's down to Waller's suggestion that ACD chose to take up medicine, rather than carry on in the art and the blood family tradition. That Doyle would take up writing Gothic stories is no surprise, given that he was basically living in one. So while environment and circumstance certainly played a major role in drawing young Arthur towards the Gothic, his favorite selections and reading material sealed the deal, as it were. And fortunately, in this regard, there is no mystery, as ACD laid out his influences very directly in a series of essays in 1894 that would be later gathered up and published as Through the Magic Door in 1907. Skipping over the expected material on novelists like Fielding, Scott, Dickens, Thackeray, Reed, etc., and looking at the section on short stories, we find Doyle's list of favorites includes Robert Louis Stevenson. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is a supremely fine bit of work, he says. Rudyard Kipling, Bret Harte, Edward Bulwer Lytton. Haunted and the Haunters is the very best ghost story that I know. Guy de Maupassant, Le Horla is as good a bit of diablerie as you could wish for. And Ambrose Bierce, who leaves its mark upon you, and that is the proof of good work. But the greatest accolades, not surprisingly, he reserves for Edgar Allan Poe. Poe is the master of all. Poe is, to my mind, the supreme original short story writer of all time. His brain was like a seed pod full of seeds, which flew carelessly around and from which have sprung nearly all our modern types of story. Just think of what he did in his offhand prodigal fashion, seldom troubling to repeat a success, but pushing on to some new achievement. To him must be ascribed the monstrous progeny of writers on the detection of crime, quorum, pars, parva, fui, which translates to in which I played a small part. Each may find some little development of his own, but his main art must trace back to those admirable stories of Monsieur Dupin, so wonderful in their masterful force, their reticence, their quick dramatic point. After all, mental acuteness is the one quality which can be ascribed to the ideal detective. And when that has once been admirably done, succeeding writers must necessarily be content for all time to follow in the same main track. But not only is Poe the originator of the detective story, all treasure hunting, cryptogram solving yarns trace back to his gold bug, just as all pseudo-scientific Verne and Wells stories have their prototypes in The Voyage to the Moon and The Case of Monsieur Valdemar. If every man who receives a check for a story which owes its springs to Poe were to pay tithe to a monument for the master, he would have a pyramid as big as that of Cheops. Now, there's a lot to unpack there, but phrases like succeeding writers must necessarily be content for all time to follow in the same main track, and the emphasis on every writer's debt to Poe speaks volumes. Clearly, home life and reading matter combined to create the perfect storm of influence. So then it's no big surprise that Doyle, once he chose to try his hand at writing, would produce stories in the Gothic field. His first story, written at around the age of 18, submitted for publication to Blackwood's magazine, but not published in his lifetime, was The Haunted Grange of Gorsbor, a straightforward ghost story. It's also no surprise that as his own life became more complex, the tightrope he walked between caring for his consumptive first wife, while maintaining a publicly chaste relationship with the woman who had become his second, giving up medical practice to become a full-time writer, creating a public persona as an English author, various family tensions, balancing jingoism with decency, failure in the political arena, attempting to codify spiritual beliefs in a scientific framework, etc. It's no surprise that he continued to write in the field. So what can we say of Doyle's output in the realms of horror and weird fiction? What sort of stories are they? Darryl Jones, in his introduction to Arthur Conan Doyle, Gothic Tales, puts it rather well, indicating Doyle's range of stories in this field cover the full panoply of the Victorian Gothic: spiritualism, supernaturalism, and the occult, colonial, Egyptomaniac, and yellow peril horrors, medical and surgical horrors, psychological tales of madness, obsession, and murder, tales of precognition and the uncanny. Now, if tackling that sort of material sounds rather grim or daunting to a reader of only Doyle's home stories, don't let it alarm you, as he writes with largely the same skill, economy of language, and charm that you're used to, even if he does slip over into the gruesome, grotesque, and downright nasty at times. As with the home stories, many of which are also wreathed in Gothic trappings, particularly Speckled Band, Copper Beeches, Devil's Foot, Creeping Man, etc. It's a long list. They're not all winners, but when he succeeds in creating an effect, he does so in a big way, with a couple actually going on to clearly influence horror writers like Bram Stoker, with The Winning Shot turning up possibly in elements of Dracula, and Arthur Machen, whereas Doyle's John Barrington Cowles may have influenced the great god Pan, while others had a curious and ineffable effect on pop culture consciousness. J. Habakkuk Jeffson's statement introduced the Marie Celeste confusion that exists to this day, and The Ring of Thoth and Lot 249 laid the groundwork for pretty much any mummy film you've ever seen. At other times, well, let's just say that Doyle was a sponge, often just redressing the ideas of others, and some stories come off as little more than unoriginal pastiche of the likes of Poe. Doyle really did knock off Poe a lot, but that's a whole other talk. Sometimes he even just knocked off himself, but in the end, they're all still highly entertaining reads. Of the 40-odd stories that I see as falling under the banner, the broad Gothic banner, less than half are particularly notable, and half of those again, though, are outstanding. So we'll just take a quick look at some of the most interesting in my view. The year 1883, when Conan Doyle was but 24, gives us two early examples of standout stories. The Captain of the Pole Star is simply a superbly sensitive and melancholy ghost story set aboard an Arctic steamer with atmospheric echoes of Poe's Arthur Gordon Pym and Shelley's Frankenstein. Meanwhile, The Winning Shot, written from a woman's point of view, tackles the subjects of mesmerism and doppelgangers, with a whiff of cannibalism thrown in for good measure. Coincidentally for Sherlockians, it's also set on Dartmoor, and even more to the point, puts paid to any questions regarding the nature of Watson's bull pup. And no, I'm not going to tell you, you'll have to go read it. 1884's John Barrington Cowles, again, deals with mesmerism, coupled with the effect of a femme fatale or vamp on would-be suitors. It's well ahead of Theda Bara, and it's a concept he'd return to and expand on with his 1894 psychic vampire novella, The Parasite. 1885's The Great Kindplatz Experiment is something of a derivative, coming hard on the heels of F. Anstey's Vice Versa novel from 1882. It's a humorous short story in a Freaky Friday vein, of all things, but the lead character is described as tall and thin, with a hatchet face and steel gray eyes, which was singularly large and penetrating, and who developed new trains of reasoning, perceiving connecting links where all had been incomprehensible and startling, and he obtained the basis of facts upon which it was his ambition to build up a new exact science. Surely that must be ringing a few bells. 1890 and 1892 give us the two mummy stories. While Poe wrote a mummy story as a means of satirical criticism, Doyle's The Ring of Thoth gives us the concept of an immortal Egyptian searching for a lost love, while Lot 249 gives us a reanimated walking mummy as a means of violence, both of which clearly combined as the basis of the 1932 Karloff film, The Mummy. These two are truly exceptional stories. 1890 also saw publication of The Surgeon of Gastrofell, which along with 1898's The Beetle Hunter are both clearly inspired by the personal tragedies surrounding Doyle's father. And they're rather strong stories as a result. 1893 brings us to the case of Lady Sanox, possibly ACD's cruelest tale of sexual jealousy, infidelity, revenge, and mutilation. It really makes you wonder what was going on in Doyle's mind at the time, since he wrote The Cardboard Box, which deals with exactly the same themes, hot on its heels. Oddly, he also basically recycled Sanox, but with a male victim in his 1898 story, The Retirement of Signor Lambert. Incidentally, once ACD finished writing the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, you can amuse yourself guessing which of his one-off stories were originally intended as Holmes plots, although there's actually no way to confirm or deny any of them. The highlight for 1894 was the novella The Parasite, but I feel compelled to also make mention of The Third Generation, if only for its surprising subject matter, hereditary syphilis of all things. 1898 was a bumper year. Alongside the aforementioned Beetle Hunter and Signor Lambert, we get The Sealed Room, The Brazilian Cat, and the most obvious Poe knockoff ever, The New Catacomb, also known as Burger's Secret, which is a variation on the Cask of Amontillado. This brings us up to the turn of the century, with the last two tales before Hound being the brilliantly humorous ghost story The Brown Hand in 1899, and the bizarre cautionary seance story involving a unicorn of all things playing with fire in 1900. And that, my friends, completes the footprints leading up to A Giant Hound. And while there are at least 10 more Gothics leading away from Hound, with 3 top-notch entries amongst them, I'll leave you to discover them for yourselves. To do so, I'd recommend picking up either of these fine collections: The Captain of the Pole Star, Weird and Imaginative Fiction, edited by Christopher and Barbara Roden, Ash Tree Press, 2004, and Arthur Conan Doyle, Gothic Tales, edited by Darrell Jones, Oxford University Press, 2016. And for further reading on the Gothic roots and role of Hound, I'd suggest Nightmare, The Birth of Horror by Sir Christopher Frayling, BBC Books, 1996. And of course, for Arthur Conan Doyle's personal reading influences, Through the Magic Door is a must-read. However, all are worth your time. And speaking of time, thank you very much for sharing your time with me today.
Thank you, Charles. Hey. Do we have any questions for Charles? Just feel free to go into the chat and type the word questions. I will call on you to unmute. A lot of applause for Charles so far. Excellent presentation. Well done.
Thanks, folks. Appreciate it.
So you can send those checks of money to Charles Prepolec. No, okay. I'm not seeing any questions yet.
Yay!
Charles covered everything, so.
Yes, Charles, it's Mark in Halifax. What do you think of all the stuff you've read of Conan Doyle's works? What do you find the creepiest?
The creepiest? Oh boy, you know, John Barrington Cowles really does hit some things for me. There's a number of them. One of my favorite stories is the case of Lady Sanox. It's just the meanest, cruelest, weirdest thing for Doyle to have written. It blows my mind. And I mean, he gets nastier at times too. The Lord of Chateau Noir is pretty much just a string of mutilation and torture. And it's very bizarre. What I find interesting is seeing, you know, you see the echoes that come through in the Sherlock Holmes stories, and I can't stop wondering where was Doyle's mind at? So, but yeah, for me, Case of Lady Sanox is one of my favorites, although The Winning Shot is also very, very high up on my list of stories.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Warren Nest. Warren, can you unmute?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hey, Charles, was like I didn't realize Arthur Conan Doyle had written this many horror stuff. Would he been like the Stephen King of his day? Was he like the #1 horror guy, or was there just a lot of that stuff going on?
He certainly wouldn't be the #1 horror guy of his day, but he was definitely in an equitable position to King today in terms of popularity. But this would have come later. You see the bulk of his horror material coming straight out of the gate. As I said, I mean, this was his background. This is what he grew up with. He grew up with fairy stories. He grew up with that weird contradiction between, you know, Edinburgh as a city. You look at this city that's split as this modern seat of learning, and yet at the same time, it's this incredible medieval history. There's so much going on. But for Doyle, no, he certainly wouldn't have been the top horror writer, but there really wasn't a genre like that. When we look at the Gothic, it's basically the birthplace of horror, fantasy, and science fiction and everything else. So to say horror writer, not really, but by the 90s, we start to see this creeping up. And you will, you know, for ghost stories, you're into pretty much the 1910 period, the early part of the 20th century, where you see the likes of M.R. James and so forth coming up, and you're seeing the ghostly tradition really hitting. But as a horror writer, yeah, he still doesn't rate as one of the top, certainly, but he does have flashes of genius that put him alongside some of the best of his contemporaries.
Okay.
Charles, we have a question from John Geehan. How would you rate the leather funnel?
The leather funnel. Now, see, that's one of those three that I put in there for the following Hound. It was published in 1902 as well, and it's an odd story. It's that psychometry thing, and it's good. I like it. I like it a lot. I mean, Doyle picked up the location from visiting one of his uncles in Paris, and that's really the setting for the story. And it's a fun, creepy story that throws back to his love of history. There's a really neat mix there. I personally really like the leather funnel.
Okay. Randy Getz has a question. How about Tales of Unease?
Tales of Unease, I can't remember what's in which collection. I hate to tell you. I'm sorry. I don't know what to tell you. His horror stories, his Gothic stories are split over so many different things. I mean, you'll find half a dozen and stuff like the Tales of Mystery or Tales of Terror and Mystery. You find them in almost every one of his collections of non-Sherlockian stories between, Captain of the Pole Star and other tales, right up until the end. So I'm sorry, I can't tell you what's in Tales of Unease.
Okay. Janice Wilson asked the question, how well received were Doyle's stories that didn't include Holmes? Was it well known that he penned horror stories?
Well, how they were received is kind of interesting. When you look at some of them, he started really trying to push a second series that were kind of tied to medical life and creepy things in the early 1890s for the Idler magazine, for Jerome K. Jerome. And Jerome took about half of them, since some were just, he felt, too strong and too nasty. So not necessarily received, certainly, with the love that Holmes was, but he still got some good mileage out of it. There's some great material there, and the reception to any Doyle story, particularly in the Strand, was positive and strong. It's not like he was hitting any kind of a wall for places to place stories. And the horror stuff was turning up, but just not quite. It's just mean, some of it. So it just didn't have as broad an appeal.
Sean Duncan has a question. I have a question about the late Holmes stories and how much they were inspired by ACD's later Gothic works. Stories like Veils seem like they were written as Gothic stories first and then shoehorned into Holmes. Elements of shotgun plays, perhaps. They feel like stories written for other purposes and were later turned into Holmes stories. Accurate? Do we have any evidence of that?
I wouldn't say yes. I don't think that there's any real sort of evidence to show where Doyle has created a story with one thing in mind and then putting Holmes in there until we get to the Hound of the Baskervilles, which in particular was never designed to be a Sherlock Holmes story. But of course, when he realized how much he needed a character to be able to carry through on this, and rather than invent something from whole cloth, he used Holmes. And of course, he could also, you know, get way more money, which is to say he doubled his rate for, it was something like £50 per 1,000 words, and he moved it up to 100, I think, for Hound. So yes, I mean, I'm sure he would have, as any writer does, he's got a whole, probably a journal full of story ideas, bits and pieces that he's going to sit there and plug in wherever the urge hits, pull something out of a drawer. Maybe this will work for Sherlock Holmes, maybe it won't. But do we have any strict evidence about which stories were which? No.
Okay. Patrick Ewan asked the question, did Doyle know or carry on a correspondence with any of the other authors you mentioned, especially Stevenson and Pierce?
Sorry, what was, especially who?
Stevenson and Pierce.
Oh, I'm not convinced he kept any kind of, or had any communication with Bierce as such. But with Stevenson, yes, they had actually a good corresponding relationship. They were both educated in Edinburgh. They were, I think, a couple years apart. Doyle thought Stevenson was the bee's knees. I mean, he was probably his favorite contemporary at that point in time. And of course, yes, we know he corresponded with Stoker. As for others, I really am not sure, but I don't think there's a whole lot of back and forth between them.
Okay. And I have a last question from Mark Alvestead. Do we know if he ever wrote this kind of work under a pseudonym?
If he did, I mean, a lot of the early material was published anonymously, which was just the norm for certain periodicals in the day. In some cases, we didn't realize stories were Doyle's until many, many years later. But did he actively write under a pseudonym? Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. I'm going to wrap it up there with the questions. Charles, thank you very much.
Oh, thanks for inviting me.
If you want to read some more about these stories, also you can go to the Arthur Conan Doyle Encyclopedia Online, done by the Sherlock Holmes Society of France. They have the text of a lot of these stories along with the illustrations. It is a great reference site there, so highly recommend that. Charles, great job, thank you. Probably the best presentation we ever had given by a Canadian at one of our meetings here. So.
Yeah, I know. We went down this road. I'm also the only Canadian who's ever given a presentation. So now the pressure's on Joanne. Yeah.
You were the trendsetter. And while we're doing this, we'll give a shout out to Peggy Perdue. She was the first Canadian to join one of our meetings, so she was the trendsetter. So, is Rich Krasunas still on the call here? We've been having some connectivity issues.
Yes, I am.
Hey, we're going